Most people fall in love the way water flows downhill, gradually, following a path that deepens naturally over time until the feeling simply becomes undeniable. Avoidants tend to fall in love through something closer to the reverse of this process, a sequence that runs almost entirely backward compared to what most people expect, where the visible signs of connection actually diminish as the underlying feeling intensifies, rather than growing more apparent the way affection typically does. This inversion confuses nearly everyone who loves an avoidant partner because it contradicts almost every intuitive assumption about how growing closeness is supposed to look and feel. Understanding this backward sequence changes how an avoidant's confusing behavior gets interpreted entirely, revealing a coherent, predictable pattern where most people only ever see contradiction and inconsistency. If the listener has loved an avoidant partner and found their behavior confusing precisely at the moments when the relationship seemed to be deepening, warmth followed by unexpected coldness, closeness followed by sudden distance, this exploration is going to trace the actual sequence beneath that confusion. 3 distinct stages that run in nearly the opposite order most people expect, and understanding them offers considerably more clarity than trying to interpret each individual moment in isolation. The first stage tends to look on the surface remarkably like conventional falling in love, sometimes even more intensely than what a securely attached person might display. This is worth naming directly, because it's precisely what makes the entire sequence so disorienting once the later stages unfold. During this initial period, an avoidant partner often appears unusually engaged, unusually curious, unusually present, reaching out frequently, initiating plans, offering compliments and attention with a warmth that feels, at the time, like genuine growing affection, following the same trajectory most relationships follow in their earliest stages. What's actually happening beneath this surface warmth differs considerably from what it appears to represent, however. This early intensity typically isn't driven by deep, established attachment, because deep attachment hasn't yet had time to develop this early in any relationship, avoidant or otherwise. It's driven instead by something closer to excitement about possibility combined with the specific safety that novelty and distance still provide. A new connection, still relatively shallow, regardless of how intense it feels, doesn't yet carry the weight of genuine vulnerability that deeper intimacy eventually requires. This means an avoidant partner can engage enthusiastically during this stage precisely because the relationship hasn't yet reached the point where their usual defenses would need to activate. The intensity feels real because it is real, but it's excitement about potential connection rather than evidence of the deep, sustained attachment it often gets mistaken for. It's worth naming directly what makes this first stage so misleading for the person on the receiving end of it. Most people reasonably interpret early intensity as a promising sign of the relationship's future trajectory, evidence that deeper feelings are developing and will likely continue growing as the relationship progresses. With an avoidant partner, this interpretation frequently proves backward. The intensity present during this earliest stage often represents something closer to a ceiling than a foundation. The most openly enthusiastic and engaged an avoidant partner is likely to appear before their defenses activate in response to the relationship's continued deepening. The second stage arrives once the relationship moves past its earliest, safest territory into something that actually requires sustained vulnerability. Typically, once real intimacy, emotional or otherwise, starts genuinely developing rather than simply being anticipated, this transition tends to trigger a noticeable, often confusing shift in the avoidant partner's behavior. The enthusiasm and warmth that characterize the first stage gradually receding, replaced by something considerably more guarded, inconsistent, or distant. This shift rarely happens instantly. It tends to unfold gradually, sometimes so gradually that the person experiencing it struggles to identify exactly when the change began, only recognizing, in retrospect, that the relationship's emotional temperature has cooled considerably from where it started. This is worth naming plainly because it's precisely the stage where most people begin questioning their own perception, wondering whether they somehow caused this shift, whether something about their own behavior produced the withdrawal now taking place. It's worth stating this directly. This shift typically has very little to do with anything the other person did wrong. It represents instead the exact point where the relationship's depth finally triggers the avoidant partner's underlying defensive structure, the same structure that had remained comfortably dormant throughout the earlier, safer stage of excited anticipation. The relationship hasn't actually failed at this point. It has simply reached the specific threshold where the avoidant's actual attachment patterns, rather than their earlier excitement about possibility, finally begin shaping their visible behavior. It's worth exploring why this second stage tends to be the most painful and confusing of the three, because it directly contradicts the trajectory most people reasonably expect based on how the relationship began. Watching someone who once seemed so enthusiastically engaged grow increasingly distant feels, understandably, like watching genuine feelings fade, like witnessing exactly the kind of declining interest most breakups eventually involve. This interpretation, while entirely reasonable given ordinary relational patterns, often proves inaccurate specifically for avoidant partners, because what's actually happening during this stage isn't fading interest, but rather fear responding directly to increasing genuine attachment, an internal alarm system activating precisely because the relationship has finally become significant enough to feel threatening. There's something worth naming here about how counterintuitive this specific mechanism actually is, because it inverts the assumption most people bring into romantic relationships that withdrawal indicates diminishing feeling. For an avoidant partner specifically, withdrawal during this second stage often indicates the opposite. Feelings that have grown significant enough to trigger genuine anxiety about vulnerability and potential loss of self within the relationship. The withdrawal isn't evidence that the connection matters less. It's frequently evidence that the connection has started to matter considerably more than the avoidant partner's nervous system currently knows how to safely tolerate. The third stage, when it arrives at all, tends to develop only after considerable time has passed, sometimes only after the relationship has already ended, sometimes only within the context of a relationship that has managed to survive the difficult second stage through sustained patience and appropriate boundaries on both sides. This final stage involves something genuinely rare and considerably more durable than either of the earlier stages, an attachment that has finally stabilized enough that the avoidant partner can express care and commitment with something closer to consistency, no longer oscillating quite so dramatically between enthusiastic engagement and defensive withdrawal. It's worth exploring what actually distinguishes this third stage from the excited, surface-level intensity that characterized the very first stage, because the two can superficially resemble each other despite representing fundamentally different underlying processes. The warmth present during the first stage was built on novelty and safety through distance, expressed freely precisely because it hadn't yet been tested by genuine vulnerability. The warmth present during this third stage, when it develops, has actually survived that testing, having weathered the second stage's withdrawal and fear without the relationship collapsing entirely, which gives it a stability and durability the first stage's excitement never actually possessed, however similar the two might appear from the outside. There's something worth naming about how rarely relationships with avoidant partners actually reach this third stage, because reaching it requires a specific combination of circumstances that doesn't always align. The avoidant partner's own genuine capacity and willingness to eventually tolerate the vulnerability their defenses initially resisted, combined with the other partner's sustained patience and appropriately maintained boundaries throughout the difficult second stage. Many relationships end during the second stage precisely because the withdrawal feels, understandably, like clear evidence that the relationship has run its course, when it may have actually represented a difficult but survivable phase within a longer backward sequence that hadn't yet reached its more stable conclusion. It's worth exploring what this backward sequence means practically for anyone currently navigating a relationship with an avoidant partner, particularly for anyone currently experiencing the specific confusion and pain of the second stage's withdrawal. Understanding that this withdrawal often indicates deepening rather than fading attachment doesn't mean every instance of avoidant withdrawal deserves patient tolerance regardless of its severity or duration. Some avoidant partners never move beyond the second stage at all, remaining permanently caught in cycles of withdrawal that never stabilize into the third stage's more consistent presence, regardless of how much patience gets extended toward them. Understanding the sequence provides context for interpreting the pattern accurately, not a guarantee that any specific relationship will successfully complete it. There's a specific dimension worth exploring here concerning what actually triggers the transition from the first stage into the second, because this transition point rarely announces itself clearly and often catches both people involved genuinely off guard. The specific threshold varies considerably from one avoidant person to the next, shaped by their particular history and the specific forms of vulnerability that feel most threatening to them individually. For some avoidants, this threshold gets crossed the moment a relationship moves from casual dating into something explicitly labeled and defined, the simple act of naming the relationship as serious, somehow activating defenses that remained dormant during its undefined earlier phase. For others, the threshold involves a specific milestone, meeting family members, moving in together, or simply reaching a point where daily routines have become genuinely intertwined rather than remaining comfortably separate. Still others cross this threshold through emotional rather than practical markers, a moment of genuine vulnerability shared, a difficult conversation navigated successfully, an experience of being truly seen that, paradoxically, produces retreat rather than continued closeness. It's worth examining how recognizing these individual triggers can help someone anticipate rather than simply react to the second stage's arrival, because understanding the specific pattern shaping a particular avoidant partner's threshold offers considerably more useful information than a general understanding of the sequence alone. Someone who notices that their avoidant partner's withdrawal consistently follows specific types of milestones, rather than seeming to arrive randomly or unpredictably, gains valuable insight into what specifically feels threatening to that particular person, information that can inform how future milestones get approached, whether through more gradual pacing, more explicit communication about what to expect, or simply through better emotional preparation for withdrawal that, while still painful, no longer arrives as a complete surprise. There's something worth naming about how this second stage's withdrawal typically manifests in specific, recognizable behavioral patterns worth understanding in detail, because these patterns tend to repeat with remarkable consistency across different avoidant individuals despite their varied underlying triggers. Communication frequency and depth both tend to decrease noticeably, not necessarily disappearing entirely, but becoming shallower, more transactional, less emotionally revealing than what characterized the first stage's enthusiastic engagement. Physical availability sometimes follows a similar pattern, an avoidant partner suddenly finding themselves unusually busy, unusually tired, unusually prone to needing space that wasn't previously required. Perhaps most confusingly, this withdrawal sometimes coexists with genuine continued affection expressed in narrower, more limited contexts. Still physically affectionate, still occasionally warm, but noticeably less willing to engage with anything requiring sustained emotional presence or vulnerability. It's worth exploring too how this second stage interacts with an avoidant partner's own internal experience, because their subjective sense of what's happening often differs considerably from how their behaviour appears externally. Many avoidants report, once they eventually develop enough insight to articulate it accurately, genuine confusion about their own withdrawal during this stage, aware that something has shifted in how they're engaging with the relationship without fully understanding why, sometimes constructing external explanations, work stress, general busyness, needing more independence, that feel plausible in the moment but don't actually capture what's really happening internally. This means the avoidant partner themselves often isn't consciously lying when they offer these explanations. They're simply reaching for the most available, least threatening account of an internal shift they don't yet have the self-awareness to describe more accurately. There's a particular consideration worth naming about how long this second stage typically lasts, because its duration varies enormously, and this variation itself carries important diagnostic information. Some avoidant partners move through this stage relatively quickly, weeks rather than months, their defenses activating briefly before settling into something more stable as they gradually adjust to the relationship's increased depth. Others remain caught in this stage for considerably longer periods, months or even years, cycling repeatedly between brief returns to first stage warmth and renewed second stage withdrawal, without ever fully stabilizing into anything resembling the third stage's consistency. This extended cyclical pattern deserves particular attention because it often indicates a considerably deeper capacity limitation than a shorter, more transient second stage would suggest. Information worth factoring into any decision about how much patience a specific relationship's pattern actually warrants. It's worth examining what role the other partner's response during this second stage plays in shaping whether the relationship eventually progresses toward the third stage or instead becomes permanently stuck in cyclical withdrawal. Someone who responds to second stage withdrawal with anxious pursuit, increased demands for reassurance, or escalating attempts to recreate the first stage's intensity through sheer effort, often inadvertently reinforces exactly the pattern of threat the avoidance nervous system is responding to, confirming that increased closeness does indeed produce increased pressure and demand. Someone who instead responds with calm, steady presence, neither anxiously pursuing nor punitively withdrawing in return, tends to create considerably more favorable conditions for the avoidance nervous system to eventually recalibrate, recognizing over time that this specific instance of increased closeness doesn't actually produce the overwhelming demand their defenses initially anticipated. There's something worth naming about how this dynamic connects to a broader pattern worth watching for. The tendency for people loving avoidant partners to unconsciously blame themselves for the second stage's withdrawal, searching for personal flaws or mistakes that might explain a shift that actually has very little to do with anything they specifically did. This self-blame, while understandable given how disorienting the shift feels, often produces exactly the kind of anxious, reassurance-seeking behavior that tends to work against the relationship's eventual stabilization, creating a difficult cycle where genuine confusion and hurt, expressed as increased pursuit, inadvertently intensifies the very withdrawal it's trying to address. It's worth exploring finally how someone can accurately distinguish, while still inside the second stage's confusing withdrawal, whether a specific relationship is likely heading toward eventual stabilization into the third stage, or is instead settling into permanent, unresolved cycling between these two states. Useful signals worth watching for include whether the avoidant partner's withdrawal, however uncomfortable, remains bounded rather than escalating indefinitely, whether they demonstrate any capacity for self-reflection about their own patterns, even if that reflection doesn't yet translate into consistent behavioral change, and whether periods of returned warmth, when they occur, show any signs of gradually deepening or extending over time, rather than remaining identical in intensity and duration to whatever brief returns occurred earlier in the pattern. None of these signals guarantee eventual stabilization, but their presence offers considerably more reason for continued patience than their absence would. It's worth naming, too, how the third stage, when it does eventually develop, typically differs from what people initially imagine it will feel like once finally reached. Many people, exhausted by the second stage's confusing withdrawal, imagine the third stage as a kind of complete transformation, an avoidant partner who has fully overcome their earlier patterns and now behaves with the same consistent openness a securely attached partner might display from the very beginning. In reality, the third stage tends to look somewhat different, more modest and more realistic than this idealized vision. It typically involves an avoidant partner who still experiences moments of discomfort with vulnerability, who may still occasionally need more space than a securely attached partner would require, but who has developed enough capacity to communicate these needs directly rather than through unexplained withdrawal, and who no longer disappears entirely during moments of increased closeness the way they once did during the second stage. There's a particular nuance worth exploring regarding how this third stage sometimes gets tested repeatedly, even after it initially develops, because reaching this more stable stage doesn't necessarily mean an avoidant partner's underlying patterns have been permanently and completely resolved. New circumstances, a major life transition, unexpected stress, a period of significant vulnerability like illness or loss can sometimes temporarily reactivate patterns from the second stage, even within a relationship that had genuinely stabilized. This doesn't necessarily indicate failure or regression in any permanent sense. It often simply reflects that growth in this area, like growth in most areas of psychological development, isn't always perfectly linear, and temporary reversions during periods of unusual stress don't automatically erase whatever genuine progress had been made previously. It's worth examining as well how children complicate this entire sequence when they enter the picture during any of these three stages, because parenting introduces demands for sustained emotional presence that interact in complex ways with an avoidant partner's existing patterns. Some avoidant partners find that having children accelerates their progression toward the third stage. The sheer necessity of showing up consistently for a child who depends entirely on their presence, forcing a kind of capacity development that might not have happened as quickly within the romantic relationship alone. Others find that the added stress and reduced personal space that parenting introduces actually intensifies second stage patterns, making withdrawal more frequent or more pronounced precisely during a period when consistent partnership matters most for the family's overall stability. Recognizing which pattern is unfolding within a specific family's circumstances can help clarify what kind of support or intervention might actually prove helpful during this particularly demanding life stage. There's something worth naming about how professional support, when it enters the picture at any point across these three stages, tends to shape the eventual outcome considerably. An avoidant partner who engages genuinely with therapy specifically addressing attachment patterns, ideally beginning during or even before the second stage's withdrawal becomes pronounced, often progresses toward the third stage more reliably and more quickly than one attempting to navigate this entire sequence without any structured support. This isn't a guarantee, and plenty of avoidant partners do eventually reach genuine stability without formal therapeutic intervention, but the presence of skilled outside support tends to meaningfully improve the odds of successful progression, particularly for avoidant partners whose underlying patterns trace back to especially significant early attachment disruption. It's worth exploring too how this three-stage sequence connects to a broader pattern worth understanding about how avoidant partners typically handle multiple significant relationships across their lifetime, because the sequence described throughout this exploration doesn't necessarily play out identically every single time. Some avoidants, having successfully navigated this entire sequence within one relationship and genuinely developed greater capacity as a result, carry that developed capacity forward into subsequent relationships, moving through the sequence more quickly or with less intensity the second time, because some of the underlying work has already been accomplished. Others find that each new relationship essentially resets the process, requiring the same difficult second stage withdrawal to unfold again, regardless of what growth occurred previously, particularly if the growth that did occur remained specific to the dynamics of one particular relationship rather than representing genuine, generalized change in their underlying attachment patterns. There's a particular consideration worth naming about how someone can protect their own well-being while navigating the uncertainty of not yet knowing which category, temporary second stage difficulty versus permanent cyclical pattern a specific relationship actually falls into. This protection typically requires maintaining genuine independence and support outside the relationship throughout the entire sequence, ensuring that one's own sense of stability and self-worth doesn't become entirely dependent on the avoidant partner's unpredictable, stage-dependent behavior. It also requires establishing clear, honest boundaries around what duration and intensity of second stage withdrawal genuinely remains tolerable, recognizing that patience, while valuable, isn't infinite, and that continuing to extend it indefinitely without any signs of eventual progression toward the third stage eventually stops serving anyone's genuine well-being, including, in many cases, the avoidant partner's own long-term interests. It's worth considering, finally, what this entire framework offers someone evaluating a brand new relationship with an avoidant partner, still early in the first stage's enthusiastic warmth, wondering whether to proceed given everything this exploration has traced about what typically follows. Understanding this sequence in advance doesn't mean avoiding relationships with avoidant partners altogether, nor does it mean entering such relationships with excessive suspicion during their genuinely enjoyable early stages. It means entering with realistic, accurate expectations, understanding that the warmth experienced early on likely represents excitement about potential rather than deep, established attachment, and that some degree of withdrawal as the relationship deepens represents a normal, predictable part of the process, rather than necessarily indicating the relationship's failure. This understanding allows for both genuine enjoyment of the relationship's early stages and appropriate preparation for whatever difficulty the second stage eventually introduces, considerably more useful than entering either with naive expectation of smooth linear progression or with excessive cynicism that prevents genuine investment from ever developing in the first place. This backward sequence, confusing and painful as it often is to navigate, reveals something important about how differently avoidant partners experience and express love compared to what most people naturally expect. The earliest enthusiasm was never necessarily false, and the later withdrawal was never necessarily evidence of the relationship's failure. Both represented genuine, if inverted, responses to a developing connection. And understanding this inversion offers something valuable regardless of where any specific relationship ultimately lands, a clearer, more accurate framework for interpreting behavior that would otherwise remain genuinely, needlessly confusing to anyone expecting love to unfold in the more conventional, forward-moving direction it takes for most people. There's one final thought worth carrying forward from this entire exploration, because it applies regardless of which of these three stages a specific relationship currently occupies, or whether it ever successfully progresses through all of them at all. This backward sequence doesn't excuse behavior that causes genuine, sustained harm, nor does it obligate anyone to remain patiently waiting through a second stage that never shows any real sign of eventually resolving. What it offers instead is accuracy, a considerably more truthful map of what's actually happening beneath confusing, contradictory behavior than the simpler, more conventional story most people default to when love doesn't unfold the way they expected it to. That accuracy matters enormously, not because it guarantees any particular outcome, but because it replaces confusion and self-blame with something considerably more stable, a genuine understanding of what's actually occurring, and from that understanding, a clearer basis for deciding how much patience any specific relationship genuinely deserves, and at what point, if the pattern never progresses beyond its difficult middle stage, that patience has reasonably run its course. This understanding also offers something valuable to anyone standing entirely outside this specific relationship dynamic, watching a friend or family member navigate the confusing middle stage of loving an avoidant partner and wondering how best to offer support. Rather than encouraging either immediate departure or indefinite, uncritical patience, this framework allows for something considerably more nuanced. Genuine curiosity about which specific signals suggest eventual progression towards stability versus which suggest permanent, unresolved cycling, paired with consistent encouragement to maintain independence, self-worth, and appropriate boundaries throughout whichever version of the sequence actually unfolds. This kind of informed, patient support tends to serve friends and family members navigating this dynamic considerably better than either uncritical cheerleading for the relationship's continuation or reflexive dismissal of it as inherently doomed from the outset. Understanding how avoidants fall in love backwards doesn't make loving one simple or painless. It replaces one kind of confusion, wondering why nothing about this relationship seems to follow the rules, with a clearer, more useful understanding, one that finally makes sense of a pattern that would otherwise remain genuinely bewildering to anyone expecting love to move only in one single, familiar direction.